The private hangar was filled with the blinding glare of camera flashes reflecting off a pristine $50 million jet. Victoria Hale, a CEO obsessed with optics, swept in with her investors. Near the engine cowling, a single dad in grease-stained coveralls stood analyzing a diagnostic panel. Victoria scoffed loudly. "Stop staring, nobody! You're ruining the photo op!" The executives chuckled. The man didn't react. He just stepped back. 20 minutes later, the jet was stranded on the runway. The cockpit alarms blared. They desperately needed a highly certified pilot to clear the air, and the only one in the facility was the man she had humiliated. His name was Daniel Reyes, 44 years old with calloused hands, a deeply lined face that spoke of quiet endurance, and the steady, unblinking eyes of a man who had spent thousands of hours staring at the curvature of the earth from 40,000 feet. He was a single father. His absolute priority, the core of his entire existence, was his 10-year-old son, Leo. Leo was a quiet, highly intelligent boy with a massive, encyclopedic passion for aviation. His bedroom ceiling was completely covered in glowing plastic stars and meticulously glued model airplanes. He knew the thrust-to-weight ratio of a Boeing 777 better than he knew his multiplication tables. But on this specific Tuesday afternoon, Leo was sitting in the small, dusty employee break room at the back of the hangar, doing his homework, waiting patiently for his dad's shift to end. Daniel worked as a line maintenance technician at Hale Aviation, a rapidly expanding private jet charter company. He wore heavy steel-toed boots and a faded oil-stained blue uniform. He spent his days checking tire pressures, replacing worn hydraulic lines, and making sure the luxury birds were safe for the billionaires who rented them. He was quiet. He was incredibly methodical. He never joined the other mechanics for beers after work, and he never bragged. Nobody at the company knew his actual history. Daniel wasn't just a mechanic. 8 years ago, Daniel Reyes was a senior captain for a global commercial airline. He had logged over 12,000 hours in the sky. More importantly, he held an active, highly specialized, top-tier type rating certification for the exact model of the new ultra-advanced corporate jet currently sitting in the middle of the hangar. He knew the avionics of that specific aircraft better than the engineers who designed it. But life had forced him to make a brutal pivot. When his wife tragically passed away from a sudden illness, the grueling, unpredictable lifestyle of a commercial pilot, the days away in foreign cities, the erratic sleep schedules, the holidays spent in lonely hotel rooms, became entirely impossible. Leo had already lost his mother. Daniel refused to let him lose his father to the sky. So, Daniel grounded himself. He took a massive pay cut, swallowed his pride, and traded his four-striped captain's epaulets for a heavy wrench. The maintenance job gave him fixed, reliable hours. It allowed him to pack Leo's lunch every morning and tuck him in every night. That was all that mattered. The woman who currently owned the hangar, the jet, and Daniel's paycheck was Victoria Hale. 41 years old, relentlessly ambitious, and fiercely driven by public perception. Victoria had recently acquired the aviation company in a hostile takeover. She didn't know the first thing about aerodynamics, thrust, or stall speeds, but she understood branding, media hype, and luxury marketing perfectly. Today was a massive day for Victoria. It was the official, heavily publicized press launch and maiden-test flight of the company's new flagship aircraft, a heavily modified, state-of-the-art long-range business jet. The hangar was swarming with influential tech bloggers, wealthy potential investors, and high-end lifestyle photographers. Victoria was in her element, wearing a perfectly tailored designer suit, holding a glass of champagne, and directing the photographers to get the absolute best angles of the gleaming silver fuselage. Daniel was working quietly near the rear of the aircraft. He had a technical manual open on a rolling cart. He was staring intensely into the open access panel of the Auxiliary Power Unit, APU. He wasn't daydreaming. He was mentally calculating the thermal threshold of a specific titanium bracket he had inspected earlier that morning. Victoria, walking backward while talking to a prominent journalist, suddenly turned and almost bumped directly into Daniel. She stopped, her perfectly practiced smile dropping into an expression of profound, unfiltered annoyance. She looked at Daniel's grease-stained uniform, his scuffed boots, and the rag hanging from his back pocket. To her, he was a visual contamination, a piece of ugly industrial reality intruding on her pristine, high-class fantasy. "Excuse me," Victoria snapped, her voice carrying sharply over the ambient noise of the hangar. "What exactly are you doing here in the primary staging area?" Daniel looked up from the engine bay. His expression was completely neutral. "I am verifying the post-inspection checklist for the APU housing, ma'am, ensuring the heat shields are properly seated." Victoria rolled her eyes dramatically, playing to the small crowd of investors standing behind her. She didn't care about heat shields. She cared about the aesthetic. "We have outsourced highly paid flight engineers for that," Victoria said, her voice dripping with sheer condescension. She gestured dismissively toward the exit. "Stop staring at the engine like you actually understand how to fly it. Nobody. You're ruining the photo op. Move your cart to the back. Now." A few of the younger, sycophantic executives laughed softly, eager to agree with the boss. Daniel felt a familiar, hot flash of defensive anger in his chest, but he instantly buried it under years of practiced, stoic discipline. He didn't puff out his chest. He didn't pull out his wallet and show her his commercial pilot's license. He didn't inform her that he had safely landed planes in hurricanes while she was still in business school. He just looked at her, his face a mask of absolute, impenetrable calm. "Yes, ma'am," Daniel said quietly. He closed the heavy technical manual, unlocked the wheels of his cart, and pushed it silently toward the shadows at the back of the hangar, blending perfectly into the background. He didn't need to prove anything to her. He just needed his paycheck to clear on Friday so he could buy Leo a new pair of sneakers. The press event concluded with a flurry of applause and popping flashbulbs. Now came the critical part of the afternoon, the initial test flight. It was meant to be a short, highly controlled 30-minute hop around the local airspace, a simple demonstration to prove to the board of directors that the multi-million-dollar asset was fully operational and ready to generate revenue. Victoria Hale absolutely insisted on being in the cockpit. She wanted to sit in the plush leather jump seat right behind the pilots to experience the power firsthand and document the takeoff for her social media executives. The pilot in command, a man named Captain Vance, was a highly paid outsourced contract pilot hired specifically for this launch. He looked the part perfectly: aviator sunglasses, crisp white uniform, and a confident, dazzling smile. The ground crew pulled the heavy wheel chocks away. The massive hangar doors rolled open, revealing the bright, baking concrete of the active runway. Captain Vance started the engines. The twin turbines spooled up with a deafening, powerful roar that shook the glass in the terminal building. Victoria strapped herself into the jump seat, her heart pounding with a mixture of adrenaline and pure financial ambition. The jet slowly taxied out of the hangar and began the long, slow roll toward the threshold of runway 27 right. Inside the cockpit, Captain Vance and his first officer were rapidly going through the pre-takeoff digital checklists on the incredibly complex glass panel avionics displays. "Flaps set to 10 degrees, Vance called out, his voice crisp over the intercom. 10 degrees, confirmed," the first officer replied. "Flight controls check. Free and clear." Suddenly, a sharp, piercing, highly annoying electronic chime echoed through the tight confines of the cockpit. Ding, 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 ding. On the primary central display screen, a glowing amber warning message suddenly flashed into existence. "Swiss fault, secondary pitch trim configuration. Verification required." Captain Vance frowned, his confident smile instantly vanishing. He tapped the screen, trying to clear the message. It didn't disappear. It stayed there, glowing stubbornly. "What is that?" Victoria asked from the back seat, leaning forward, her pulse quickening. "Is something broken? We have investors watching from the lounge." It's a trim configuration warning, ma'am," Vance said, his hands flying across the computer keypad, digging into the submenus. "It's not a primary flight control failure. It's a secondary sensor disagreement regarding the horizontal stabilizer." "So fix it," Victoria demanded, checking her watch. "We have a strictly narrow window from air traffic control." Vance began to sweat slightly. He pulled up the digital flight manual on his tablet. He read the procedure rapidly, his face drained of color. "Ma'am, there's a problem," Vance said, his voice losing all its bravado. "This specific aircraft has the new Block 4 software upgrade. My type rating certification is only valid up to Block 3. I haven't completed the simulator hours for this specific software variant yet." "Speak English, Captain," Victoria snapped, the stress causing her voice to shrill. "What does that mean for my flight?" "It means I am legally locked out of overriding this specific system warning," Vance explained, sounding defeated. "According to FAA regulations and our strict insurance policy, a secondary trim fault on this new software block can only be manually verified, cleared, and signed off by a pilot holding an active, fully updated Block 4 type rating for this exact airframe. If I take off with this amber light on, I lose my license, and your insurance is entirely voided." Victoria stared at the back of his head in absolute, horrifying disbelief. "You're telling me a multi-million-dollar jet is grounded on the tarmac because of a software technicality?" "Yes, ma'am. Until a certified pilot physically enters his credentials into this keypad to clear the fault, the throttle computers will not allow us to apply takeoff power. It's a hard lock." Victoria ripped her headset off. She pulled out her cell phone and dialed the director of operations back in the hangar. "Marcus!" Victoria yelled into the phone over the sound of the idling engines. "I have a Block 4 type rating lockout in the cockpit. Vance isn't certified. Get me a pilot who is. Right now." There was a frantic, terrified pause on the other end of the line. Marcus, sitting at his computer in the terminal, began frantically typing, searching the global employee database. "Victoria, I'm looking," Marcus stammered, panic lacing his words. "Our other two senior captains are currently in London. The contract agency doesn't have anyone available within a 4-hour radius. We are completely out of certified personnel." "Look harder!" Victoria screamed, watching the minutes tick away, imagining the investors in the lounge laughing at her failure. "Search the entire regional database. I don't care what it costs. Find me someone with a Block 4 certification for this jet." Marcus typed furiously. He expanded the search parameters. He removed the filter for active flight roster and searched the entire company payroll, including ground staff, logistics, and maintenance. A single lonely name popped up in bright green letters on his screen. Marcus blinked. He rubbed his eyes, thinking it was a glitch in the HR software. He clicked the profile. He saw the active, fully updated FAA certification numbers. He saw the thousands of logged flight hours. "Victoria," Marcus said over the phone, his voice dropping to a whisper of profound shock. "Did you find someone?" she demanded. "Yes, but you're not going to believe this." "Who is it? Where are they?" He's in the hangar, Victoria. It's Daniel Reyes, the line maintenance tech. The guy in the gray coveralls. He holds an active, unrestricted Block 4 master captain's rating for that exact aircraft." Victoria Hale went entirely, absolutely still in the jump seat. The blood drained completely from her face. The phone almost slipped from her trembling fingers. The man she had just publicly mocked. The man she had humiliated in front of her investors. The man she had literally called a nobody. He was the absolute only human being within 100 miles who could save her company from total humiliating disaster. If you believe that a piece of paper and a fancy title mean absolutely nothing compared to true, undeniable, battle-tested expertise, hit that subscribe button to witness the exact moment the cockpit door finally opens. The massive corporate jet sat idling on the sun-baked tarmac, a $30 million paperweight. Inside the hangar, the director of operations sprinted across the concrete floor, dodging toolboxes and extension cords, until he found Daniel in the break room. Daniel was quietly helping Leo with a complex fraction problem on a piece of scratch paper. "Daniel!" Marcus gasped, out of breath, his face pale. "We need you. Now. On the jet. It's a Block 4 trim fault. You're the only one on the payroll with the certification." Daniel looked up from the math problem. He didn't jump to his feet. He didn't smile triumphantly. He simply placed his pencil down on the table with deliberate, agonizing calmness. He looked at his son. "Leo, stay here. Finish problem number 7. I'll be right back." "Okay, Dad," Leo said, not even looking up from his paper. He was used to his dad fixing things. Daniel stood up. He didn't run. He walked. He walked with the slow, measured, heavy stride of a professional who absolutely refused to let external panic dictate his internal heart rate. He bypassed the flashing lights of the terminal. He walked out into the blinding, oppressive heat of the tarmac. He approached the sleek silver jet. The heavy air stairs were lowered. Daniel climbed them, his steel-toed boots thudding rhythmically against the metal steps. He stepped into the luxurious, climate-controlled cabin. He walked past the empty, cream-colored leather seats, straight toward the open cockpit door. Victoria Hale was standing right in the threshold of the cockpit, looking incredibly small, intensely nervous, and profoundly embarrassed. She saw the grease stains on his uniform. She remembered her own cruel words echoing in her head. "Stop staring, nobody!" She swallowed hard, her pride completely fractured. "Mr. Reyes, we have a situation." Daniel didn't gloat. He didn't demand an apology. He didn't even acknowledge her previous insult. He was currently operating on pure, cold aviation protocol. "Excuse me, ma'am," Daniel said softly, stepping past her, his broad shoulders easily brushing past her tailored suit. He stepped into the cockpit. Captain Vance and the first officer looked up at him with a mixture of intense confusion and desperate hope. "Captain Vance," Daniel said, his voice dropping into a deep, resonant tone of absolute authority. "I am Daniel Reyes, FAA license number 449-882. I hold an active Block 4 type rating for this airframe. I am here to verify your secondary trim fault." Vance immediately slid his seat back, giving Daniel room to access the center console. "Thank God. We're completely locked out, man. It's throwing a code 72 Alpha." Daniel didn't immediately touch the keyboard. He didn't start pushing buttons like a panicked amateur. He operated with surgical, terrifying precision. "Pull the physical maintenance logbook," Daniel ordered the first officer. The first officer scrambled to grab the heavy binder from the side pocket and handed it to Daniel. Daniel opened the book. His eyes scanned the messy handwriting of the previous shift's technicians. He flipped back 3 pages. He found exactly what he was looking for. "Yesterday evening," Daniel said, tracing a line with his calloused finger, "the night shift replaced the physical position sensor module on the rear horizontal stabilizer. It was a standard hardware swap." "Okay, so?" Victoria asked nervously from behind him. "Is it broken?" "No, ma'am," Daniel replied without turning around. He leaned forward and began typing on the FMS keypad. His fingers moved with lightning-fast, practiced muscle memory, diving deep into the encrypted maintenance menus that standard pilots never accessed. "The hardware is perfectly fine," Daniel explained calmly, his eyes locked on the screen. "But the new sensor is slightly more sensitive than the old one. When you powered up the APU today, the primary flight computer read the new microvoltage from the sensor and didn't recognize the digital signature. It threw a configuration warning because it thinks the wing is unbalanced. It's not a physical failure. It's just a digital misunderstanding." Captain Vance watched in awe as Daniel bypassed 3 layers of security prompts. "So how do we fix it? Do we have to tow it back and replace the sensor again?" "No," Daniel said. "We just have to introduce them." Daniel reached up to the overhead panel. He flipped 2 obscure toggle switches in a highly specific sequence, cutting the raw power to the secondary sensor array for exactly 5 seconds. He counted silently in his head. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. He flipped the switches back on. Then he typed a 12-digit authorization code into the main keypad, his personal master pilot credential code. "Executing manual 0-point calibration," Daniel announced to the silent cockpit. He hit the enter key. For 3 terrifying seconds, the entire cockpit went dead silent. The screens flickered. Then, the harsh, annoying amber warning light vanished entirely. The primary display refreshed, returning to a beautiful, calm, perfectly stable layout. A small green text box appeared in the corner. "Systems nominal. Trim configuration verified." Captain Vance let out a massive, explosive breath of pure relief, falling back into his leather seat. "Holy hell, you did it! The throttle lock is disengaged. We have full power access." Daniel stepped back from the console. He didn't wipe imaginary sweat from his brow. He didn't smile. He had performed a task he had done 100 times before in simulators in real life. He turned to the captain. "Your secondary trim is verified and calibrated, Captain. The aircraft is 100% structurally and digitally sound. You are fully clear for departure." Daniel turned around and walked out of the cockpit. He squeezed past Victoria Hale, who was staring at him with her mouth slightly open, utterly speechless. He walked down the air stairs, back into the blistering heat of the tarmac, and headed straight back to the hangar to finish helping his son with his math homework. He left the billionaires in awe of a man wearing a dirty gray uniform. The 30-minute test flight was profoundly, wonderfully, incredibly boring. There were no dramatic near misses. There were no terrifying alarms, no engine fires, no screaming passengers. Captain Vance flew the jet in a wide, smooth circle over the city, and the aircraft performed with absolute mathematical perfection. It was a flawless piece of machinery. When the jet finally taxied back into the hangar and the engines whined down into silence, the investors in the lounge clapped and cheered, completely unaware of the disaster that had almost ruined the day. Victoria Hale didn't celebrate. She didn't pour herself another glass of champagne. As soon as the air stairs were lowered, she walked straight past the cameras, straight past her eager PR team, and marched directly across the hangar floor toward the small, dingy employee break room. She pushed the door open. Daniel was sitting at the cheap plastic table, eating a ham sandwich out of a Tupperware container. Leo was sitting across from him, excitedly drawing a picture of the Gulfstream jet they had just watched land. Daniel looked up. "Can I help you, Mrs. Hale?" Victoria stood in the doorway. She looked at the peeling paint on the walls, the flickering fluorescent light, and the man who held a master's certification worth hundreds of thousands of dollars eating a packed lunch. "Why didn't you tell me?" Victoria asked, her voice quiet, entirely stripped of its usual corporate aggression. "When I insulted you out there, when I called you, what I called you, why didn't you throw your credentials in my face? Why didn't you tell me you were a senior captain?" Daniel put his sandwich down. He wiped his mouth with a paper napkin. He looked at her calmly, without a single trace of resentment or bitterness. "Because I wasn't hired to be a senior captain today, Ms. Hale," Daniel said simply. "I was hired to be a line maintenance technician. I was hired to check the APU heat shields. My ego isn't tied to a title, and my self-worth isn't dependent on whether you know my resume." He looked at Leo, who was happily coloring the wings of his drawing. "I don't need a fancy uniform to know who I am. I just need to do the job in front of me correctly so I can go home to my son with a clean conscience. You were stressed. You lashed out. It happens. It didn't change the fact that the heat shields needed checking." Victoria felt a deep, profound sense of shame wash over her. She had spent her entire career evaluating people based on their superficial labels, their clothing, the brand of their watch, the title on their LinkedIn profile. She had built an entire corporate culture around looking important rather than actually being competent. She realized that the most valuable, the most highly skilled, and the most incredibly disciplined human being in her entire multi-million-dollar company was a man who deliberately chose to be invisible. She had mocked him because he was looking closely at a machine. She hadn't realized he was reading its soul. The next morning, the atmosphere in the Hale Aviation hangar was tangibly different. Victoria Hale called a mandatory all-hands meeting on the main floor. The pilots, the executives, the PR team, and the entire maintenance crew gathered around. Victoria stood in the center. She didn't have a script. She didn't have a teleprompter. "Yesterday," Victoria began, her voice echoing clearly, "I made a severe, humiliating error in judgment. I looked at a member of our team, evaluated him entirely based on the uniform he was wearing, and I disrespected him publicly." The hangar was dead silent. The mechanics exchanged shocked glances. CEOs never apologized. "That man," Victoria continued, looking directly at the back of the crowd, "stepped into a cockpit 20 minutes later and saved a $50 million asset and this company's reputation with absolute grace and professionalism." She took a deep breath. "Effective immediately, we are completely overhauling our internal personnel tracking. Every single certification, every ounce of experience on this floor will be documented, respected, and utilized. There are no nobodies in this hangar, only professionals. She looked at Daniel, who was standing in the back, arms crossed, his face neutral. Daniel Reyes, Victoria announced loudly, I am officially offering you the position of Chief Technical Aviator. You will bridge the gap between the maintenance floor and the flight deck. You will run the final diagnostic checks on every jet before it leaves this facility, and you will be paid the salary of a senior captain. The mechanics around Daniel erupted into cheers, slapping him on the back. Daniel walked forward slowly. The crowd parted for him. He stood in front of Victoria. The salary is appreciated, Ms. Hale, Daniel said quietly, ensuring only she could hear. But my son gets out of school at 3:15 p.m. I will not miss his soccer games, and I will not work weekends. I am a father first, an aviator second. Victoria smiled. It was the first truly genuine, humble smile she had worn in years. Mr. Reyes, she said softly, you can set your own hours. I don't care when you work. I only care that you are the last person to touch these planes before they fly. Daniel extended his grease-stained hand. Victoria took it, shaking it firmly, ignoring the oil that transferred to her pristine skin. He didn't need to brag. He didn't need to show off. He had simply remained exactly who he was, a master of his craft. And in doing so, he had forced a billionaire to finally see the truth. The heaviest, most undeniable power in the room never needs to shout. It only needs to step up when the fragile, arrogant illusions shatter, and the real work needs to be done. If you firmly believe that true skill and quiet competence will always ultimately defeat loud arrogance and superficial titles, hit that subscribe button to follow more powerful stories of the quiet truth winning in the end. Tell us in the comments down below. Have you ever been severely misjudged, ignored, or mocked in a professional environment just because of your job title or appearance? How did you stay completely calm and prove them absolutely wrong?